I'm Trisha Egan, Lily's mom.
Okay. I offer the following definitions in support of my case. My case is that military conscription is unjust, and I offer the following definitions. Justice is defined as the process or result of using laws to fairly judge cases, redress wrongs, and punish crimes. And fair is defined as marked by impartiality, honestly, free from self-interest, prejudice, or favoritism. The definition of military conscription is compulsory enrollment of persons, especially for military service. My first contention is that the draft is unjust because it goes against our right of freedom. It is an infringement of liberty and violates basic human rights because it is a form of forced labor and involuntary servitude.
So, can you say it one more time? Can I ask for that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It is an infringement of liberty and violates basic human rights because it is a form of forced labor and involuntary servitude.
Would it be violating human rights if there was no conscription and we didn't have people fighting for us, right? So like we would be taken over by, let's say, a communist country because we had no one fighting for us. I feel like that might also violate human rights.
That's true. And I acknowledge your point, but my second contention is that the draft has historically affected the poor and marginalized, and it reduces military effectiveness because people who don't choose to serve are forced to, and it costs more because people need training and aren't prepared to go into the army, and those who volunteer won't do as good of a job because they only will serve for the amount of time that they were required to. So to refute your point, the people that are being forced to serve we might still be taken over by the communist country because they aren't going to want to do it if they're being forced to. And that isn't a 100% everyone, but for the most part, most people that are being forced to serve don't want to do it. But I understand that there are a select few that will take it seriously and do a good job. But most people are not going to give it their everything, and they're just going to do the bare minimum that they're required to. And although it is constitutional, it's unjust.
I see your point, and it's tough to argue the unjust point part, but I do also feel like some army is better than no army. Just meaning if no one is going to sign up, because this day and age people aren't necessarily willing to work very hard, then I guess, yeah, some army is better than no army.
That's true.
In my opinion.
Okay, my next contention is that the draft disrupts civilian life and can cause long-term social and economic issues. It separates individuals from their families and communities, causing emotional distress, and it can also disrupt educational and career paths by forcing young people to postpone or abandon their studies. The draft also let's just start with that. It can disrupt educational and career paths by forcing young people to postpone or abandon their studies.
It's very true. But if we are at war, a serious war, that will also be disrupting career paths because factories will be redesigned to make military equipment, and college degrees will be focused on weapons and things that are needed to fight that war for that intermediate time anyway. So I think our lives are disrupted either way. So I'm not really sure. I mean, you make a good point that would happen. But depending on the severity of the war, our lives would be disrupted anyway. Those people's lives would be disrupted anyway. Especially like, let's say their houses are getting bombed. Well, okay, obviously that's disrupting their lives. If they're going to school for something that isn't a necessity at the time, their degree might get put on hold anyway. If they're working in a factory that makes canned goods, all of a sudden they might be making military rations instead of canned goods, and their lives would have to change no matter what.
That's true, but the draft also takes skilled workers away from various jobs, which negatively impacts economic productivity and growth, and the costs of military support, such as healthcare, pulls funds away from other essential social support programs because the people drafted, the government has to pay for all of their health care and everything, and the long-term effects of mental conditions such as PTSD will leave veterans and their families with long-term health challenges and expenses, which adds further strain on social support systems. And this kind of refutes the point that we need to protect our country at all costs, because if we do win the war and then we have all of these expenses and challenges from the draft and we're just in a ton of debt anyway, then it doesn't really matter because the nation's ruined either way. And all of this connects back to the definition of justice because it goes directly against the fairly judging and redressing wrongs, and it's not for the good of the people.
I would argue that it is for the good of the whole, and I guess it kind of comes down to that theme that's in a lot of books. What about the greater good? So, if people's houses are getting bombed, or lives are getting ruined in other ways because of war, I feel like military conscription, if that in any way could have prevented the decline of the country's greater good, then maybe it should be done.
Can you repeat that?
I guess it comes down to the greater good. So if the people's houses are getting bombed and lives are getting destroyed and jobs are disrupted because a war is happening, in my opinion, if military conscription was mandatory and certain people had to serve, and there was a chance that would prevent the greater good of the entire country from declining, then that should be the route we would take.
That's true, and I do think that the draft should be implemented in the case that it's for the greater good, but I think it's important to remember that the prompt we're arguing is whether or not it's just, and I agree that if it's for the greater good, then it should still be implemented, but I think if we go off the definition of justice, that it doesn't follow it and that the draft is unjust. So to conclude, I think that military conscription is unjust because it disrupts civilian life, has historically affected the poor and marginalized, and goes against our human right of freedom. I stand resolved that military conscription is unjust, and I stand for cross-examination.